by. Your conference is about to begin. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the special public teleconference board meeting conference call. I would now like to turn the meeting over to Jim Hart. Please go ahead, Mr. Hart.
Hello?
I'd like to call this meeting to order. Good afternoon, everyone.
Okay, thanks. Bye.
My name is Jim Hart, and I'm the chair of the Toronto Police Services Board. Welcome to this special meeting that we've called. The board believes that holding a special board meeting in this way and at this time is the appropriate and responsible approach in the current circumstances, as governments, public authorities, and members of the public all work together to address the unique and difficult challenges presented by this pandemic. Although this meeting is taking place on the phone, we acknowledge that the land we're on as we make this call is traditional territory of many nations, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat peoples. It is now home to many diverse First Nations, Inuit, and Métis people. The board also acknowledges that Toronto is covered by Treaty 13, signed by the Mississaugas of the Credit, and the Williams Treaties, signed with multiple Mississaugas and Chippewa bands. I'd now like to ask members, are there any declarations of interest on the Municipal Conflict of Interest Act? Seeing none, let me proceed. Again, thank you to everyone who has joined us today on this call. These are unprecedented times that we're living through. Our daily updates from the Prime Minister, the Premier, and the Mayor are stark reminders about our current reality. And yet, all that we continue to work through, it is critically important that the board is able to continue with its governance and oversight work. While we cannot meet in person as we normally do, these difficult times require us to think differently about how we will conduct our business. We're doing the best that we can, and we're thankful to everyone that's worked to get us to this point. This is our first Tele-Meeting, so please bear with us as we try this for the first time. We've taken a lot of measures and tried to consider multiple possibilities to ensure that this call runs smoothly. But please be patient with us if we do have hiccups. With that said, I'm going to turn it over to the board's executive director, Mr. Ryan Peschner, who will go through some additional information. Ryan?
Thank you, Chair Hart, and thank you to everyone who has joined this call. Please note that this meeting is being live streamed on the Toronto Police YouTube account and will be available there at the conclusion of this meeting. On the line, we have Chair Jim Hart, Vice Chair Marie Molinar, Councillor Francis Nunziata, and members Upala Chandrasekera and Ainsworth Morgan, as well as members of our board office staff. We also have Chief Mark Saunders, Deputy Chief Peter Ewan, CAO Tony Veneziano, members of their staff, and of course on the line listening we have members of the public. We have individuals who have also registered to make deputations on both items on the agenda. As per our regular meeting process, deputations will be heard after a presentation or description of the item is provided and prior to the motion or substantive item being discussed and voted on by board members. When it comes time to do a deputation, those who have registered will be brought into the call by the operator. As always, deputants will have up to 5 minutes to speak, followed by an opportunity for board members to ask them questions. At today's meeting, there are 2 items on the agenda. First, a notice of motion made with notice, moved by Vice Chair Molinar and seconded by Councillor Nunziata, titled Procedural Changes for the March 26th, 2020 Special Public Meeting of the Toronto Police Services Board in response to the COVID-19 pandemic. And in addition, a report authored by me titled Board Delegation of Authority, Information Sharing and Consultation Protocol in response to the COVID-19 pandemic. The agenda and both of these items can be found on the Police Board's website at www.tpsb.ca under the Agenda tab. I'll now turn the meeting back over to Chair Hart.
Thank you, Ryan. The first item we have on the agenda is a notice of motion made with notice, moved by Vice Chair Molinar and seconded by Councillor Nunziata, titled Procedural Changes for the March 26, 2020 Special Public Meeting of the Toronto Police Services Board in response to the COVID-19 pandemic. motion was made with notice and is already published for members of the public to see, I will ask Vice Chair Mulliner to summarize it. Marie?
Thank you, Chair Hart. This is Vice Chair Marie Mulliner speaking. Thank you to everyone who's joined us today, including the board, staff, and the Chief's Office and members of the public. As we all know, a number of recommendations have been made by the Toronto Public Health Unit in response to the COVID-19 pandemic. And these have been reinforced by the declaration of a state of emergency by both the province of Ontario and the City of Toronto, so that we can prevent further transmissions of the virus by reducing physical and social interactions. These measures include a prohibition on all organized public events of more than 50 people. Because the board must carry on in fulfillment of its statutory responsibility, and because the board also recognizes the importance of open and public meetings and values the participations of members of the public through their attendance and deputations at those meetings, we are cognizant of and respect the recommendations by Toronto Public Health, the city's medical officer of health, and other health professionals to protect the health and well-being of the public and the board employees. These measures include the need for social and physical distancing, and where the public meetings are held, transitioning to virtual meetings like today where possible. In addition to the need to practice social and physical distancing, the board is unable to hold an in-person public meeting at this time because of the prohibition on gatherings and because the locations where meetings are held are currently closed to the public. If approved, this motion will permit the board to proceed with this special public meeting where board members would participate by phone. Registered members of the public could provide deputations and, along with the media, can join the call or listen to the proceedings live through our simultaneous webcast. So I am moving a motion that permits, and this is in 4 parts, that the special public board meeting of March 26, 2020, that board members participate in the board meeting by telephone, A. B, that board members be deemed present for the purpose of quorum when participating by telephone. And C, board members who are participating by telephone vote at this meeting. I'm going to propose to read all the 4 sections, and then we can return to any specifics if there are questions. The second section ensures, the second section part of the motion ensures that this special public board meeting of March 26, 2020 remain open to the public through the use of live telephone conferencing technology, and that a complete audio recording of the special public board meeting be posted on the internet as soon after the meeting as is practical. The third part of the motion, any deputations are to be heard in accordance with Rule 17 of the procedural bylaw by way of telephone conferencing technology. And the fourth and last part of the motion waives, pursuant to Section 4.4 of the procedural bylaw, any rules of procedure necessary to proceed in accordance with items 1, 2, and 3 of this motion. I thank Councillor Nunziata for seconding this motion. I turn it back to you, Chair Hart.
Thank you, Vice Chair. For this first item, we have 1 deputant on the line. Mr. Chris Langenfeld. Please note that as with our regular deputations, you will have up to 5 minutes. Operator, please put through our first deputant.
Certainly, sir. Mr. Langenfeld, your phone line is now open. Please go ahead, sir.
Thank you. Hello, board. Can you hear me? Can members of the board hear me?
This is Jim Hart. Yes, we can, Chris. Go right ahead.
Thank you. Yes, I have an issue, procedural issue, I guess, with the fact that this motion is being made over the telephone, and I don't know of any authority at this point for the board to hold a meeting over the telephone in order to, in fact, approve telephone meetings. So I don't think that at this point the board has, in fact, is currently holding a proper meeting. I know that Black's Law Dictionary defines meeting as a coming together of persons, an assembly, particularly in law, an assembling of a number of persons for the purpose of discussing and acting on some matter or matters in which they have a common interest. And Duhame's Law Dictionary, which is the Canadian context, defines a meeting as the coming together for the transaction of a lawful object of two or more persons. And so technically I don't believe that this telephone conversation constitutes a meeting under law, and since the board has yet to approve that a telephone conversation can substitute for an in-person meeting, whether or not that would in addition be satisfy the requirements of the Police Services Act, which I'm not sure it would, but at this point I don't even think that the board's procedural bylaws allow for this meeting to take place over the telephone. I suspect that the board would have to get together and hold an in-person meeting, which would of course require the public to be allowed to be present in accordance with the Police Services Act, and then the board could perhaps approve this type of meeting to take place in future. I note that we've probably all heard that the banks and insurance companies went to court in order to get a court order to be permitted to hold their annual meetings over the telephone or over internet and teleconferencing. And so I have to question why the board isn't then required to go to court and get a judge's approval in order to hold this meeting over the phone as opposed to in person. I also note that in the motion, the motion, in fact, on page 2 of the printed version, it references to find it here, it's in relation to footnote 2. It says, those recommendations include practicing social distancing and, where public meetings are held, transitioning to virtual meetings where possible. And that's footnoted as item 2, a notice from the Toronto Medical Officer of Health, update on COVID-19, March 18th, 2020, and there is the reference there on that footnote. I've read and have that public health notice from Dr. Elaine Davila, the Medical Officer of Health, from March 18th at 3:45 p.m., and it makes no mention, in fact, of anything to do with public meetings or any type of transitioning to virtual meetings. So, in fact, that is not the truth, what is stated here in the motion. I also note that the motion makes reference to a memorandum from the Ministry of the Solicitor General. I've been in touch with the Solicitor General now several times by email and telephone over the last 3 days, trying to get a copy of this and review this document, which is apparently a March 23rd, 2020 document entitled Guidance to Police Service Boards Regarding Meetings. And I have been unable to find that document. So I have no idea what it says and whether or not it in any way authorizes these kind of meetings taking place, and so I have to question how we can base it on that. So I simply don't believe that at this point there is any legal justification, and I don't believe it conforms with the requirements of the Police Services Board Act to hold a meeting by telephone at this point. That's the end of my submission.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Langenfeld. Okay, thank you, operator. Members of the board, do we have any questions for Mr. Langenfeld? Seeing none, can I ask our Executive Director, Mr. Ryan Teschner, to comment on some of the things that Mr. Langenfeld brought to our attention?
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chair. This is Ryan Teschner speaking. The ability of the board to hold this meeting comes from a few sources and also some guidance from the Ministry of the Solicitor General. There's nothing that I'm aware of in the Police Services Act that speaks to the need for meetings to be held in person, but rather that there be a quorum of members and that the appropriate business be discussed at these meetings. We did receive, as did all police services boards in Ontario, direction or guidance from the Ministry of the Solicitor General in a memo dated March the 23rd, 2020. In this guidance document to boards, It speaks about the current context involving the pandemic, the importance of coming up with alternative methods and manners for boards to conduct their business as is required by statute. And in particular, they do speak about looking at other ways that boards can meet, including conducting them virtually, as long as boards take all measures available to facilitate public and media participation in open meetings. So the absence of specific requirements for in-person meetings under the Act, coupled with this guidance from the ministry, has led us to a place where we have assembled this meeting by ensuring that members of the public can indeed participate, as Mr. Glagenfeld just did through his deputation, that there's a live stream audio for all other members of the public and members of the media to listen to the meeting live, as well as an audio recording that will be available thereafter. We follow the guidance from the ministry to ensure that this board can continue to function and fulfill its governance and oversight responsibilities. Thank you.
Mr. Lagenfeld, thank you very much for your deputation. And Mr. Teschner, thank you very much for your comprehensive response. We will now move into the discussion portion of this notice of motion. I open the floor for questions or discussion, if any, by board members. Please state your name before speaking. Members, do you have any questions, or would you like to speak? Okay, seeing none, for the sake of this phone call, we will now move to a recorded vote. When I call your name, please state whether you're in favor or not in favor of the motion. Vice Chair Molinar.
I'm in favor. Thank you.
Councillor Francis Nunziata.
Yes.
Member Upala Chandrasera.
I'm in favor. Thank you.
Member Ainsworth Morgan.
I'm in favor. Thank you.
And myself, Jim Hart, as the chair, I am in favor. The motion carries. Thank you, everyone. Moving on to the second report. Report Board Delegation of Authority, Information Sharing and Consultation Protocol in response to the COVID-19 pandemic. Now on to our next item on the agenda. This item is a report from the board's Executive Director, Ryan Teschner, titled Board Delegation of Authority, Information Sharing and Consultation Protocol in response to COVID-19 pandemic. At this time, I will turn over to Mr. Teschner, who is the author of the report. Mr. Teschner?
Thank you, Chair Hart. This is Ryan Teschner speaking. I'd like to start by reiterating that the board recognizes that we are in the midst of an unprecedented public health emergency. Perhaps even more so at times like these. The board must ensure it remains continually engaged in discharging its legislative mandate to ensure the adequate and effective policing in Toronto. The board should also be cognizant of its public-facing role and seek to provide reassurance to the community that it continues to fulfill its civilian governance and oversight responsibilities, both with respect to the COVID-19 related pandemic and other matters that fall within the board's statutory mandate. We also have to work to be nimble as circumstances require. Given our current situation, there are obstacles to the board meeting as it usually does. However, there must still exist a mechanism for responsive and informed decision-making related to urgent matters that go to the adequacy and effectiveness of policing in Toronto. Therefore, I am recommending that the board approve the recommendations listed at the beginning of my report, namely, the delegation of authority to permit consideration of urgent decisions that are operationally necessary for the Toronto Police Service, and the creation of a formal information sharing and consultation protocol to permit the regular and consistent provision of information relevant to the board's responsibilities in law. I will summarize the three recommendations that are currently before the board. I'd like to note that the full recommendations are contained within the board report that is in the agenda, which has been posted to our website. The recommendations can be summarized as follows. Number one, recommending the delegation of authority by the board to the chair and vice chair to authorize, approve, award, execute agreements, or otherwise permit requests from the Chief of Police that are determined to be urgent and operationally necessary. Second, the requirement that the Chair and Vice Chair report all exercises of their delegated authority, whether requests are approved or not, at the next regular meeting of the Board, and also as we identify appropriate mechanisms to the public in the interim. And three, the creation of a formal information sharing arrangement in relation to the COVID-19 response by the Toronto Police Service and related matters via the information sharing protocol that is outlined in my report. And with that, I will turn it back to Chair Hart.
Thank you, Mr. Teschner. I understand that we have two deputies on this item. Again, please note, as with our regular deputations, you will have 5 minutes. Operator, please put our first deputant through, who I believe is Mr. Chris Langenfeld.
Certainly, sir. Mr. Langenfeld, your line is now open. Please go ahead.
Thank you. I note, firstly, that I don't see a reason to actually delegate the authority to 2 members of the board. The reality is Toronto, because of the size of the city, has a 7-member board in order to protect the public. The idea that we're now going to delegate the authority of those 7 members to 2 members, and there is no longer going to be public notice or public discussion of what's happening until the board holds a regular meeting, goes against the whole purpose of having a police board. The requirements of the police board that they be open to the public, and now what the board is essentially doing is delegating its open public meetings to private conversations between the board chair and vice chair in order that at some point in the future they will notify the public of what they decide. I note, first of all, that the board obviously didn't have any problem with 2 days' notice in creating a meeting, a teleconference meeting, notifying the public, providing the documents, and having a number, proper quorum of the board meet by telephone. So it seems impossible to imagine a circumstance where that wouldn't be possible should one of these urgent matters that this delegation of authority is supposed to cover, in fact, arise. Nothing would exist to prevent the board from simply then having another special telephone meeting and notifying the public of what was planned to ensure that things aren't going on behind the public's back. At a time where a declaration of emergency has been made by multiple levels of government, and we have advanced powers being released to police officers and governments to be making decisions without proper oversight, and now all of a sudden we're turning around and saying that now the decisions that are being made are going to be made by a select group in secret, and they promise to notify the public at some point in the future of what they decide, goes against the whole concept of having a board, having public meetings, those meetings being statutorily required to be open to the public. Furthermore, I note that it is the sole discretion of the chair to adjourn a meeting, as in fact happened for the regular meeting that was scheduled to happen today, and it was solely by the chair's decision to not hold that meeting. So the fact that Mr. Teschler's motion or agenda item is to have this have items deferred until the next regular meeting, in fact means that public disclosure of decisions by the chair and vice chair are deferred until the chair decides that he wants to hold a meeting, at least in so much as there are 4 meetings required in a year, and I suppose the last remaining 2 could be held on December 29th and 30th of the year. So maybe it'll be until then, and for the next 6 months, 2 members of the board will act unilaterally in secret without notifying the public of any decisions they make, rather than having the board members get together on the telephone like they are today and publicly disclosing what they're saying and having a public record of what they decide. So that to me seems inappropriate. As I say, at this time when states of emergency are declared, that's when democracies are often subverted and when problems arise. And so it seems inappropriate to be dismantling the systems of democracy that our laws have in place in order to circumvent that and delegate the authority of policing to individuals. I also note that on a telephone conversation, it's in fact impossible to tell whether we in fact have the people that claim to be speaking on the phone, or we simply have a not very complicated computer-generated voice or a bunch of recordings sliced together, which could be used to approve just about anything. So really, this is creating a significant dismantling of the protections that exist for the public, and I would suggest that in fact we could be moving to probably computer-based internet communication with cameras, so we could in fact see that it is members of the board that are in fact speaking, and that could be done on notice with public disclosure of what the intention is, so that the protections under the law can in fact be maintained. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Langenfeld. Okay, thank you, operator. Board members, do you have any questions for Mr. Langenfeld? Seeing none, can we move on to the second deputant, please, Mr. Derek Moran?
Certainly. Mr. Moran, your line is now open. Please go ahead.
Can you guys hear me? Hello?
Derek,
can you guys hear me?
Derek, it's Jim Hart. We can hear you very clearly.
Okay. I got my own little Google timer here that I just started. So I just want to say, by me speaking at this meeting, this shall not be deemed to be in any way my consent expressed or implied. In doing so is fraud. God bless Her Majesty the Queen, and long live Her Majesty the Queen. And let the record show his person is defined as a corporation in the Legislation Act of Ontario. If I've ever led the Toronto Police Services and or the board to believe in any way that I am the person, then that would be a mistake, and that I ask all of you to please forgive me. So take notice that the Emergency Management and Civilian Protection Act, EMCPA, is invalid and of no force or effect, as it lacks the enacting clause required of it by Section 6 of the Legislation Act of Ontario. Take notice that if the EMCPA were to come into force, what Section 7.0.2 subsection 1 says, the purpose of making orders under this section is to promote the public good by protecting the health, safety, and welfare of the people of Toronto. Now notice it doesn't say persons, it actually says the people of Toronto in times of declared emergencies in a manner that is subject to the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms. Take notice in the EMCPA, the definition for necessary goods, services, and resources means food, water, electricity, fossil fuels, clothing, equipment, transportation, and medical supplies, services, and supplies. Take notice, this is the Ontario Attorney General's definition for security in their glossary section on their website. Security is defined as money or other valuables that may be required to be paid into court or to another party. But to point out, the first thing they say there, right there, is money. Take notice, this is what the Nova Scotia Court of Appeal mentions in regards to the security of the person. This is from Zetfen Brothers Construction versus D. Widag Systems, 1987. Professor Hogg, in his constitutional law in Canada, states, as noted in the previous paragraph, it is arguable that the phrase security of the person extends to a person's capacity to satisfy his basic human needs through the receipt of income. Think of money that I just mentioned earlier in security. But security of the person cannot extend to economic interests generally or property rights generally. Take notice, this is what the Ontario Superior Court Divisional Court said in regards to satisfying basic human needs, Mass versus Ontario Minister of Community and Social Services, 1996. Whatever the outer limits of the concept of security of the person may be, it must at least involve having adequate food and shelter for physical survival. Although the question of economic rights fundamental to survival is an open one in the Supreme Court of Canada, it has been considered by courts below that level. There, Professor Hogg considered the argument that security of the person in Section 7 included the economic capacity to satisfy basic human needs. Take notice, this is what the Supreme Court of Canada mentioned in regards to the provision of necessaries for one's support. This is from Singh versus Minister of Employment and Immigration, 1985. The Law Reform Commission in its working paper suggested that the right to security of the person means not only protection of one's physical integrity, but the provision of necessaries for its support. The Commission went on to describe the provision of necessaries in terms of Article 25, Paragraph 1 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which reads, "Everyone has the right to a standard of living adequate for the health and well-being of himself and his family, including food, clothing, housing, and medical care, and necessary social services, and the right to security in the event of unemployment, sickness, in this case, disability, widowhood, old age, or other lack of livelihood." Commentators have advocated the adoption of a similarly broad conception of security of the person in the interpretation of Section 7 of the Charter. Take notice, this is my email to Mayor Tory, which I haven't received a response to yet, asking him about the security of the person for providing the basic necessities of life. Hi, Mayor Tory. I got a form letter response from your office the first time I asked this, but it didn't answer my question. Regarding the economic response plan that Prime Minister Trudeau unveiled the other day, in relation to Section 7 of the Constitution Act 1982, does this mean we can use the security of the person everyone has the right to and the right not to be deprived thereof to discharge any debt with towards providing the basic necessities of life? Now, I think I just heard from the roll call Ryan did that Mayor Tory isn't there. So, I mean, if these three levels of government aren't going to let us use the security of the person towards providing the basic necessities of life, I mean, these are just evil people, Chair Hart. So I expect an answer. Oh, there goes the timer. I expect an answer, a real answer from Mayor Tory.
Hey, Derek,
thank you. The rules.
Thank you, Derek. Your time is up. Thank you, operator. Board members, any questions of Derek? Seeing none, I'd like to thank both of the deputants, and Derek, I'd like to thank you for providing your comments to the board in writing. I open the floor for questions of the board staff for discussion. Please state your name before speaking. Any questions of board staff members? Okay, seeing no questions, can I get a mover and seconder of the recommendations of the report from Mr. Teschner? Would somebody like to move the report, please?
This is Vice Chair Mulliner. I move the report.
Thank you very much, Vice Chair. Could I have a seconder, please? I will second the report. Chair Jim Hart. Now we will go through all in favor. As I list your name, please indicate whether you are in favor or not. Vice Chair Mulliner.
In favor, thank you.
Councillor Francis Nunziata.
Yes.
Member Upla Chandrasera.
In favor, thank you.
Member Ainsworth Morgan.
In favor, thank you.
And myself, Chair Hart, in favor. The report is approved. And that is our final item on the agenda. Thank you so much to everyone who called in to participate. While we do not know when the board will be holding its next meeting, we are actively exploring this alongside the need to look at new ways of doing business, balancing our responsibilities, and the need for public transparency, accountability, and consultation. I anticipate that this will not be our last virtual meeting. However we choose to proceed, we will be sure to communicate it widely through our website, news releases, social media platforms, as we have been. With that, I'm going to ask for a motion to adjourn. Can I get a mover and a seconder?
Vice Chair Mulliner moves to adjourn.
And a seconder, please.
Francis will second.
Thank you very much, Councilor Nunziata. Any opposed? Hearing none, the motion carries. This meeting is adjourned. Thank you, operator. We can now end the call.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Ladies and gentlemen, your conference is now ended. All callers are asked to hang up their lines at this time, and thank you for joining today's call. Ladies and gentlemen, your conference is now ended. All callers are asked to hang up their lines at this time, and thank you for joining today's call.